Imagine the future president of the world's largest democracy standing outside a classroom. Not in a suit, not with security, but as a skinny, barefoot boy dripping from the monsoon rain, waiting to be told whether he is even allowed to sit inside. Because of his caste, some of his classmates don't want him near their benches. Because of his poverty, he hasn't paid his school fees. And somewhere in a country still under colonial rule, no one could have guessed that this boy, this untouchable, would one day command the respect of prime ministers, generals, and presidents. This is the story of K.R. Narayanan, and the clock starts ticking for him from the very moment he is born. He arrives in the world on 27th of October 1920 in the little village of Perumthanam, in what was then the princely state of Travancore, today's Kerala. No hospital, no electricity, no birth certificate with golden letters. Just a hut with a thatched roof, leaky in the rain, built on land the family does not really own. His father, Kocheri Raman, is an Ayurvedic practitioner. In theory, that sounds respectable. In reality, he treats the poor, often accepting rice instead of money, and sometimes nothing at all. His mother, Papiyama, holds the household together like a quiet, exhausted axis. They belong to a Dalit community, the people India's caste system decides are polluting. To most of the world around them, this family is visible only when someone needs cheap labor. From the start, there is a silent rival in the boy's life, the invisible line that says, "You cannot cross beyond this point." That line has many faces: the landlord, the upper caste student, the colonial official, the teacher who looks away when insults are thrown, the written rule that never mentions him, and the unwritten rule that bans him from almost everything. The boy is given a long name, Kocheril Raman Narayanan, but at home he's just Narayanan, another pair of small hands to fetch water, collect firewood, and help his father with errands. The days are long, but something about the boy unsettles the order of things. He keeps asking questions. Why is that path forbidden? Why does that well belong to them and not us? Why can some people read newspapers and others only listen? Books are luxury items in Perumthanam. Narayanan first sees them the way other children might see jewels in a glass case, precious, unreachable. His father owns a few tattered volumes in Malayalam, their pages already turning brown. When guests come, the father sometimes reads aloud from them, and the boy sits in a corner, eyes wide, catching every word. One evening, as a storm darkens the sky, a neighbor mentions that a new village school has opened some distance away. It doesn't sound like much, just another government building, just another teacher with a dusty register. But for Narayanan, that sentence lands like a thunderclap. A school means writing. Writing means records. Records mean a place in the world. The catch? It's far. Several kilometers of walking. And there is no money for proper clothes, no extra sandals. His father hesitates. His mother wonders if they can spare his labor. But the boy has already made a decision he cannot yet put into words. If there is a door, even half open, he will not die without trying to push it. At dawn, he starts. Barefoot on the rough road with a small slate under his arm, he walks through fields, past houses where other children are still asleep. The monsoon mud clings to his ankles. Sometimes he runs the last stretch, afraid the headmaster will shut the gate and send him away. Inside the classroom, his world fractures. On one side, boys with shoes, satchels, neatly oiled hair, ink pens. On the other, Narayanan, with his worn-out shirt and borrowed slate. He can feel the stairs on the back of his neck. Whispers, Dalit, untouchable. A few pull away their benches as if his shadow might stain them. The teacher, however, is a twist in the script. Instead of throwing the boy out, he lets him sit. Maybe it's just indifference. Maybe it's quiet rebellion. But for Narayanan, it feels like a narrow crack in a fortress wall. Soon another twist, fees. However low the school fee is on paper, for this family it's a mountain. One week the money doesn't come, then another. One day word reaches him. If the fee isn't paid, he cannot write the exam. The clock is suddenly tangible. There is a date on a sheet of paper, a time scribbled on the blackboard. Miss this and a whole year is gone. For a boy already walking on a rope between survival and education, a lost year is not just an inconvenience. It is one more argument for those who say, children like you don't belong here. He walks back home with a storm raging inside. His father listens silently, disappears for hours, and returns with a small bundle of coins. No one tells Narayanan exactly what was sold or pledged. A utensil, a piece of jewelry that his mother kept hidden. All he knows is that the next morning the headmaster accepts the fee. The exam date stays. Time has been bought back, but at a price the family will feel in their stomachs. He studies harder. When there are no lamps, he sits by the faint light from a neighbor's house. When there are no books, he borrows and returns them with a near-religious care. He learns not just lessons, but the shape of a larger world. British India, distant London, strange political ideas like equality, and rights that sound almost like fairy tales in his village. The social rivalries around him sharpen. Even now, he is sometimes asked to sit at the back of the room. Some classmates refuse to touch anything he's touched. But in one place, on the exam answer sheet, the caste system falls briefly silent. There, only handwriting and thought matter. And in that silent space, Narayanan begins to win. Teenage years arrive like another test. The little village school is no longer enough. If he wants to go further, he must leave Paramthanam and move to a town. The family's finances, already stretched to the breaking point, are now put under impossible stress. There is a quiet, painful family council. Can they afford this? Can they let a son dream so far beyond his station that the dream itself becomes dangerous? His mother, who knows hunger more intimately than any textbook could describe, does something that will echo through history. She says yes. So he goes to high school. To new teachers, new subjects, new prejudices, and surprisingly new allies. Some teachers recognize in him that stubborn, searching look of a mind that won't sit still. They lend him books in English whose very letters seem to twist and dance at first. He wrestles with them until they yield their meaning. He hears of distant leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, names carried to him through newspapers and whispered conversations. India is stirring. Protests, marches, jail terms, the roar of a freedom movement growing in strength. He is still a student, but he can feel the tremor in the ground. The idea forms slowly. Perhaps knowledge is not only a personal escape. Perhaps it is also a weapon. The rival in his story begins to shift shape. It is no longer just the upper caste boy who sneers, but an entire structure. Colonial power, caste hierarchy, economic exploitation that insists people like him stay exactly where they were born. To fight such a structure, he realizes, he must master not only numbers and grammar, but the language of power itself. By the time he reaches college at the University College in Trivandrum, he chooses English literature, the very language of the rulers. To many, this seems ironic. To him, it is strategic. He arrives on campus still carrying the stigma of his background, but now the battlefield is broader. He is competing with students from wealthy, established families who grew up surrounded by books, debates, English newspapers. Some of them will later become lawyers, judges, politicians. Against this well-armed army, Narayanan's only weapon is a relentless discipline. He sits for hours in the library, devouring Shakespeare, Milton, modern English prose, but also texts on politics and economics that he finds in adjacent shelves. He doesn't just want to understand literature. He wants to understand how societies are built and broken. Exams become his arena. Each top rank is more than a mark sheet. It's a public crack in the prejudice that says, Dalit boys cannot compete at this level. His success does not erase discrimination. He still feels it in snubs, in invitations not extended, in the casual way others talk about servants, as if people like his parents were furniture. But the marks on his certificates are undeniable. They are door keys, not to palaces yet, but to corridors that were once unimaginable. Still, in the background, the clock keeps ticking. He is growing older. Independent India is not yet born. Jobs are scarce, especially for someone of his origin. Every year that he spends studying is another year of uncertainty for his family. So, after college, he turns to work. He tries his hand at journalism in Bombay, writing for respected newspapers like The Hindu and The Times of India. He lives in cramped lodgings, watches the city's violent contrasts, luxury hotels on one side, pavement dwellers on the other, and learns how information is shaped, how stories can be tools of change or instruments of control. Bombay exposes him to a new kind of rivalry, the urban race for relevance. Voices clamor for attention. Ambitious young men elbow each other for influence, careers, proximity to power. Narayanan, still quiet in manner, chooses a slower, riskier path. He sends off applications for scholarships abroad. It seems absurd. A Dalit boy from Paramthanam aiming to study in London. in the beating heart of the empire that has ruled his country for nearly 2 centuries. But history again has a twist ready. He is awarded a scholarship to study at the London School of Economics. The support comes from Indian industrialists, including J.R.D. Tata, who see potential in this serious young man with sharp eyes and impeccable exam records. There is a catch and a deadline. The scholarship is for a limited period. He has a fixed number of years to survive in a foreign city, master a demanding curriculum, and emerge with a degree that can justify every rupee that has been spent on him. If he fails, there is no safety net waiting back in Paramthanam, only the same fragile hut, the same debt-ridden family, the same labels he has been trying to outrun. In London, the clash of worlds is almost dizzying. From village dust to city smog, from barefoot walks to tram rides, from a society that calls him untouchable to a campus where no one knows his caste but everyone can hear his accent, see his modest clothes, and sense that he is not from their world. He studies under Harold Lasky, one of the most influential political thinkers of the era, a man whose ideas inspire leaders and revolutionaries across continents. In Lasky's classroom, discussions blaze about democracy, socialism, colonialism. Words like parliamentary system and civil liberties are not abstract to Narayanan. They are lifelines to a future he hopes India will one day claim. He works obsessively, days in lectures, evenings in the library, nights in cold, cheap rooms. There is barely any heating. Some winters he studies with his coat on, breath faintly visible in the air. The scholarship money is never quite enough. He picks up small jobs to stretch it further, guarding each pound as if it were a piece of his family's sacrifice. The time pressure is brutal. Exam dates are set, deadlines for essays loom. He cannot afford a failed paper or a repeated term. While other students may comfort themselves with the possibility of returning to family businesses or estates, for Narayanan, failure is simply not an option. He emerges with distinction, first-class honors. On the day he receives his degree, the young man from Paramthanam stands in a hall where walls have seen generations of empire builders. Now, among those robed figures is someone they would once have refused to even seat in a classroom. But perhaps the most fateful moment comes not at a ceremony, but in a quiet office. Harold Lasky, impressed by Narayanan's mind and character, writes a letter of recommendation to one of his former students in India, a man named Jawaharlal Nehru. The letter travels thousands of kilometers, carrying with it an extraordinary possibility that a boy born outside society's walls might be invited into the heart of the newborn Indian state. Narayanan does not yet know it, but this sealed envelope will drag him into a new arena altogether, diplomacy and later politics, where his lifelong rival, structured inequality, will take on new faces, privileged bureaucrats, cynical politicians, and a political competitor who will one day stand in his way as he climbs higher and higher. For now, all he feels is the same mixture of urgency and determination that has followed him since that first barefoot walk to school. The world is changing. India is on the verge of independence, and with it, a violent reshaping of power. The question is no longer whether K.R. Narayanan can escape his origins. It is whether, with time running out and powerful rivals ahead, he can turn his journey from hut to university hall into something that might change the destiny of millions who share his history. Jawaharlal Nehru opens the envelope, reads a single page, and pauses just long enough for the room to feel the weight of his silence. On that page is the name of a man he has never met, a man from a hut in a Kerala village most of Delhi has never heard of, a man who, if the old caste rules still fully applied, would not be allowed to sit in Nehru's drawing room, let alone help shape the foreign policy of a soon-to-be independent nation. In a country still trembling from partition riots and refugee columns, this moment seems small. One file, one recommendation, one possible posting. No headlines, no slogans, no marching crowds. But this is the moment when the British Empire's favorite school, the London School of Economics, quietly passes one of its sharpest students back to the country that empire ruled. Inside that neat official file, the clock starts again for K.R. Narayanan, and the deadline is no longer his exam date. It is the future of an India trying to prove that people like him will not be kept outside the gate forever. He returns to India in 1948 as the tricolor still feels new in the sky, as trains bring not tourists but bodies, as maps are being redrawn with more blood than ink. Delhi is a city of tents and files, Refugee camps mushroom in open grounds. In government corridors, men in khadi hurry past men in ill-fitting suits, arguing about borders, ministries, and budgets that cannot possibly stretch far enough. Into this chaos walks Narayanan, thin, serious, wearing a borrowed coat that still smells faintly of London fog. He carries a degree in his bag and memories of lectures from Harold Lasky ringing in his head. He also carries something far less fashionable in those polished corridors, a Dalit identity that no degree can erase. Nehru reads Lasky's words praising this young man's intellect and integrity. He looks up, sees the calm, steady eyes of Narayanan, and makes a decision that could easily have gone the other way. You should join the Foreign Service, Nehru says. Not as charity, as strategy. There is a catch. Admission to the Indian Foreign Service is brutally competitive, dominated by the same classes who once filled the colonial civil service. Upper caste, English-educated, socially secure. There is no reservation, no special quota that will open a side door for him. If he wants in, he has to fight on the same narrow bridge as everyone else. The exams are another ticking clock. He has been abroad. He has been away from the shifting political currents of home. There is no guarantee that theory alone will get him through. But the boy who walked barefoot to a village school, who studied under a dim neighbor's lamp, now marches into one of the hardest exams in the country with the calm of a long-distance runner. He passes. In 1949, he enters the Indian Foreign Service. For the first time, the government of Free India places a Dalit man at the front door through which the nation will speak to the world. His first postings are far away from the flags and flashbulbs of big embassies. He is sent as a junior diplomat to Rangoon, then Tokyo, then London again, not as a student this time, but as a representative of a newborn republic that the world is still trying to understand. The rivalry has changed shape now. Gone are the schoolyard taunts. In their place, cool, cutting remarks in drawing rooms, subtle exclusions in service clubs, the stiff politeness of colleagues who do not quite know what to do with a man like him in their midst. At formal dinners, crystal glasses clink over polished tables, while somewhere in his memory a thatched roof leaks in the monsoon. He hears ambassadors speak smoothly about development and remembers his mother counting out grains of rice. In Rangoon one evening, the story takes an unexpected turn. He meets a young Burmese woman, Ma Tint Tint, educated, curious, unafraid to challenge him in conversation. They talk first of books, then of politics, then of everything else. In a foreign city, in the shadow of old empires, the son of a Dalit healer from Kerala falls in love with a Christian woman from Burma. It is, in almost every direction, the wrong decision according to society. Intercaste is already scandalous. Interreligious and international feels almost like a provocation. Permission is needed. Family doubts must be faced. Bureaucratic approval must be obtained. Again, time presses. Postings change, people move, opportunities close. He knows that if he hesitates too long, the machine of the Foreign Service will simply carry him elsewhere and the moment will vanish. He does not hesitate. They marry. She takes the name Usha Narayanan. It is a personal act, but in that marriage, quiet and unadvertised, there is a rebellion. The future president of India choosing love over the barbed wires of caste and border. Yet, even in his private victory, another rival is watching, the clock of his professional life. Foreign Service careers run on tight timetables, postings every few years, promotions that can be won or lost by a single bad report, a retirement age that waits like a wall you can see years in advance. For a man who started late, who lost years to poverty and distance, each delay feels heavier. If he wants to matter beyond a file number, he has to climb faster than the service quietly expects someone of his background to climb. He rises. In 1967, almost 2 decades after independence, Narayanan becomes India's ambassador to Thailand. The boy who once sat at the back of a classroom is now seated at the head of long tables with flags standing behind him. Behind the scenes, the rivalry within the service hardens. There are officers whose families have dined with prime ministers for generations. They have their own networks, their own quietly arranged paths to powerful postings. Narayanan has only his record. His cables are precise, his analyses sharp, his conduct impeccable. He is not the loudest voice in the room, but when crises emerge, his superiors notice that his reports tend to be the ones that age well. From Thailand, he goes on to serve in Turkey, then in Australia. Each country offers him a different mirror in which to see India's place in the world. He watches military dictatorships and parliamentary debates, urban booms and grinding rural poverty, and he files away pattern after pattern in his mind. But it is in the mid-1970s that he is sent to the posting that will test him most severely. Beijing. India and China have not exchanged ambassadors since the 1962 war, a humiliation India still carries like shrapnel beneath the skin. The border is quiet but unresolved. The distrust is deep. When Narayanan arrives in 1976 as India's ambassador to the People's Republic of China, he is stepping into a no-man's land of frozen gestures and diplomatic minefields. He lands in a Beijing still recovering from the Cultural Revolution, a city of loud slogans and quieter fears. Every word is political, every silence is too. Here, the rivalry is almost geological. Two ancient civilizations, two gigantic populations, two fragile new states trying to decide whether they are enemies, rivals, or reluctant partners. Narayanan moves carefully. He studies Chinese politics late into the night, listens more than he speaks in meetings, carries in his head not only his brief from Delhi but the unspoken fear of millions in India who remember 1962 as a scar. Slowly, small cracks appear in the ice. There are visits, statements, symbolic gestures. They do not solve the border. They do not erase mistrust. But they mark a thaw, and in that thaw, his work is crucial. Back in Delhi, files with his name on them travel upwards marked with a quiet respect that has nothing to do with caste and everything to do with competence. Still, something gnaws at him. He has spent his life so far negotiating with foreigners, attending banquets, writing dispatches that will be read by a tiny circle of powerful people. Meanwhile, in Perumthanam and thousands of villages like it, Dalit children are still waiting outside schoolrooms when it rains. He can continue to climb the diplomatic ladder, perhaps retire as foreign secretary, collect a neat pension and a few respectful obituaries. Or he can step off the safe path, late in life, and walk back into the mess he left behind. Indian domestic politics. Once again, the clock laughs. He is not a young man anymore. He has no political base, no caste block behind him, no pocket borough he can call his own. And yet, when asked if he will consider entering Parliament, he does not say no. He knows that if people like him remain only behind foreign desks, the structure he has fought all his life will stay firmly in place at home. In 1984, at an age when many begin to think of retirement, K.R. Narayanan stands as a candidate for the Lok Sabha from Ottapalam in Kerala. The contest is not polite. On one side, Narayanan, backed by the Indian National Congress, bearing the credentials of a seasoned diplomat but little direct political experience. On the other, a hard-fighting left opponent, sharpened by years of local struggles, claiming that Congress has forgotten the poor and the oppressed. There is another, subtler rival in this race, distrust. To some in his own constituency, he is the high-class diplomat in a suit, a man who has spent years abroad speaking English in foreign capitals. To others in the established Congress leadership, he is the outsider who did not pay his dues in party trenches, the Dalit intellectual, who must be managed rather than fully included. The campaign clock is brutal. A few weeks to cross thousands of homes to explain why a man who once debated socialism in London now wants to fix roads and irrigation canals in rural Kerala. He walks, speaks, listens. He does not roar at rallies. He reasons. He talks of foreign policy in language of local pride, of class and caste injustice, with the cool precision of a man used to drafting communiques. Voters respond. Some remember the boy who left Perumthanam years ago. Others see for the first time a leader who has been both invisible and everywhere in their lives. He wins. The ambassador becomes a member of parliament. The man who once carried cables across embassies now carries grievances from farmers and weavers into the echoing halls of the Lok Sabha. Almost immediately, he is pulled into the inner machinery of government. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, hunting for people who can speak the language of global economics without forgetting where they come from, appoints him Minister of State for Planning. Numbers now become his battlefield. He must argue inside air-conditioned rooms for budgets that will decide whether thousands of villages receive electricity, whether a scholarship scheme lives or dies, whether development becomes another word that flows around Dalit communities instead of into them. He serves as Minister of State not just for planning, but later for external affairs and for science and technology. Everywhere the same rivalry repeats. visions of a high-tech, globally admired India versus the stubborn reality of caste-ridden, unequal everyday life. He pushes for inclusive policies, for technology that does not simply build satellites but lifts those who have never seen a light bulb in their homes. Time, however, is unforgiving. By the early 1990s, India is in crisis, economic, political, moral. Coalitions wobble, governments fall. Communal violence erupts with a ferocity that shakes even those hardened by decades in public life. Narayanan is nearing 70. Most of his college classmates are long retired, their world reduced to family and memory. He instead is about to be pushed into a role that will demand everything he has learned from every hut, every classroom, every embassy. In 1992, he is elected Vice President of India. The office looks ceremonial from the outside, a stately residence, formal functions, a chair in the Rajya Sabha. But in a fractured political landscape, the Vice President can suddenly become the calm center of a storm. Inside Parliament, tempers flare, deals are struck and broken, history bends in late-night sessions no camera ever fully captures. Narayanan sits above the well of the House, gavel in hand, balancing not just procedures but egos, ideologies, and the stakes of 1 billion lives. His rival now is chaos itself, the possibility that India's democratic experiment, already scarred by an emergency in the 1970s, might slide again toward authoritarian shortcuts or unravel into fragments. He gains a reputation, firm but fair, unwilling to reduce the Constitution to a set of ceremonial phrases. Those who expected a quiet, deferential Dalit elder in the chair find instead a presiding officer who insists that rules matter, that Parliament is not a theater but a responsibility. And then, as India approaches the 50th anniversary of its independence, the question no one quite dares to ask aloud begins to form in political backrooms. Can this man, born untouchable, trained in the empire's classrooms, tempered in global diplomacy and domestic struggle, be trusted with the highest office in the land? 1997, the golden jubilee of independence, the year India chooses its new president. By now, the presidency is not just a constitutional post, it is a symbol projected onto every school wall and postage stamp. In a country still chained by caste in countless invisible ways, the idea of a Dalit president carries an electric charge, but symbols are never gifted easily. The opposition rallies around a formidable rival, N. Seshan, the former chief election commissioner, a man whose iron hand over corrupt practices and political defiance has made him a folk hero of sorts. On paper, the contest looks like a duel between two very different kinds of integrity. Seshan, the aggressive reformer, famous for confronting politicians. Narayanan, the quiet constitutionalist, famous for persuading them. Behind the curtains, the numbers game begins. Presidents in India are not elected by the public. They are chosen by an electoral college of MPs and MLAs. Every party counts its votes, tests its alliances, calculates its leverage. For Narayanan, the stakes are brutal and personal. If he loses, he will likely fade from the center of power, remembered as a nice idea that the nation was not ready to accept. If he wins, he becomes not just another name in the list of presidents, but the first Dalit to occupy Rashtrapati Bhavan, the massive sandstone symbol of power once reserved for the viceroy of the British Empire. The clock is visible again. The day of the vote circled on calendars, the hours ticking down as party whips make calls, cut deals, demand discipline. Whispers circulate. Some say a man of his background will not be allowed to actually exercise presidential power. Others fear exactly the opposite, that he will be too independent, too unwilling to sign whatever is placed before him. Narayanan, as always, does not shout. He lets his decades of work speak for him. The cables from Beijing, the debates in Parliament, the students he once encouraged as Vice-Chancellor of Jawaharlal Nehru University, the careful, measured interventions as Vice President. On voting day, the ballots are cast. Across India, state assemblies echo with the scratch of pens marking preferences. In Delhi, in the great circular Parliament building, MPs step up one by one to drop their votes into boxes, each slip a tiny verdict on history. When the counting ends, the margin is not close. K.R. Narayanan defeats N. Seshan by an overwhelming majority. In that moment, the barefoot boy from Perumthanam, the student who studied under a neighbor's lamp, the Dalit diplomat who navigated the icy corridors of foreign chanceries becomes the president of India. The rival he has carried all his life, the invisible line that said, "You cannot cross beyond this point," is shattered at the very apex of the Republic. But this victory is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the most dangerous phase. Because in the grand echoing halls of Rashtrapati Bhavan, with its chandeliers and red carpets and long silent corridors, the real test is not whether K.R. Narayanan can sit in the president's chair. It is whether, with time running out and the country lurching through coalitions, riots, and economic shocks, he will dare to use the powers of that office in ways no one expects from a man who was once told he did not have the right even to sit in a classroom. The answer arrives sooner than anyone expects. Barely months into his term, a slim file arrives on the president's desk. On the cover, one word that has terrified Indian democracy for decades: proclamation. Inside, the cabinet's recommendation: dismiss the elected government of Bihar under Article 356, impose president's rule, send the assembly home. On paper, it is routine. For years, Delhi has toppled state governments like pieces on a chessboard, often for reasons that have more to do with arithmetic in parliament than with constitutional breakdown on the ground. Most presidents have signed. Some have hesitated, asked a few questions, then signed anyway. The unwritten script is clear. The president is the head of state, not the head of government. He does not second-guess the cabinet. K.R. Narayanan opens the file and reads not just the note, but the subtext. He knows what Article 356 has done to India in the past. Whole state governments dismissed at midnight, oppositions crushed, regional parties taught lessons. He knows that behind this neat legal mechanism often lies the oldest of India's rivalries, one group thinking it has the right to rule over another. He also knows his own clock. He has 5 years, no more. No guarantee of a second term. 5 years to decide again and again whether he will be a decoration or a circuit breaker. The cabinet expects a signature by evening. In the high echoing rooms of Rashtrapati Bhavan, where British viceroys once signed orders that redrew entire continents, the Dalit boy from Perumthanam does something no Indian president has dared to do with such blunt clarity. He sends the file back. He writes that the government has not convincingly shown that constitutional machinery has failed in Bihar, that dismissing an elected government is an extreme remedy, and that the cabinet must reconsider. The political class jolts. The man many thought would quietly occupy the chair has just told the government of India, "I am not your rubber stamp." The newspapers call it a constitutional earthquake. Old hands mutter that he is overstepping. But outside those circles, in villages where the president's name is usually just a line in school textbooks, word spreads that the Rashtrapati has actually said no to Delhi. Narayanan has crossed a line, not against the Constitution, but in its defense. His real rival in office has just been named, the tradition of presidential silence, and he has only begun. Rewind to the night of his oath, July 1997. The chandeliers blaze above him in the Central Hall of Parliament. Generals in ribboned uniforms, judges in black robes, politicians in white khadi stand shoulder to shoulder. He repeats the words of the oath in a voice that does not tremble. When he finishes, a ripple moves through the hall like a crowd collectively remembering where this man began. Later, he will say that a man from a thatched hut in a remote village has entered Rashtrapati Bhavan, and in that line, millions hear something dangerous and exhilarating, the possibility that the gate is no longer reserved. But once the applause fades, he finds out what the job actually feels like. His days become a choreography of protocol. Guards of honor on the forecourt, ambassadors presenting credentials with perfect bows, silver cutlery aligned to the millimeter for state banquets. Yet Narayanan quietly rewrites even this choreography. He changes guest lists. Alongside tycoons and party bosses, he insists on inviting school children, writers, scientists, people from Dalit and tribal communities, who have never seen the inside of Rashtrapati Bhavan except on Republic Day television coverage. In the long columned Durbar Hall, you can sometimes see a village teacher standing awkwardly under frescoed ceilings, holding a cup of tea with both hands as liveried attendants hover nearby. The message is not shouted, but it is clear. This house will not belong only to those who have always felt at home in power. Outside, though, the world is changing at a speed that makes protocol look like slow motion. In May 1998, the Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee authorizes a series of underground nuclear tests in Pokhran, In the deserts of Rajasthan, the earth shudders, and with it the balance of South Asia. Within hours, phones begin to ring off the hook in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Foreign leaders want explanations, reassurances, anything to reduce their own fear. Some reports say the president was told at the last minute. Others that security secrecy kept him out of the planning. He does not join the game of leaks and denials. He steps up instead into a narrower, more dangerous space, the space between national pride and global alarm. As head of state, he must endorse the decision, stand by the elected government before the world. As a man who studied under Harold Lasky and absorbed the language of disarmament and peace in London seminar rooms, he knows the terrifying arithmetic of nuclear weapons. He chooses his words like a surgeon chooses instruments. India, he says, has not tested in order to threaten, but because the unequal global nuclear order leaves it no choice. At the same time, he calls for total universal nuclear disarmament. It is a balancing act on a razor. Both nuclear hawks and global critics search for a slip. They do not find one. In chancelleries abroad, diplomats note, perhaps grudgingly, that India's first Dalit president speaks the language of law and restraint, more convincingly than many from countries that have possessed bombs for half a century. At home, another storm is gathering. 1999, the government falls. In the Lok Sabha, amid shouting and counting, Vajpayee's coalition loses a vote of confidence by one single vote. In that narrow loss lies an explosion of possibilities. Who will rule now? Who has the numbers? Will there be horse trading, last-minute defections, new alignments? Once again, the path of the Republic narrows down to a quiet room in Rashtrapati Bhavan. As president, Narayanan must decide whom to invite to form the next government. The Constitution gives him no magical formula, only the principle that whoever he calls should have a reasonable prospect of commanding a majority. It is the kind of judgment call that has been misused before to favor friends and punish enemies. Delegations stream into the palace. Leaders speak of numbers, flash letters of support, hint at alliances not yet public. Sonia Gandhi, now leading the Congress, comes to him and claims that her party and its allies may be able to gather the crucial 272. He listens, asks for written evidence, for lists and letters, not just promises delivered in soft tones. Time is tight. The markets are jittery. The armed forces need clear authority. The world is watching to see whether India can transfer power without slipping into chaos. This is where his years as a diplomat show. Narayanan does not allow himself to become an errand boy for anybody's ambitions. He refuses to be rushed. When the letters do not add up, when Sonia Gandhi herself admits she does not have the numbers, he does not manufacture a majority for her, just as he did not conjure one for Vajpayee. Instead, he allows Vajpayee to continue briefly as caretaker prime minister and calls for fresh elections. In those days, whispers course through Lutyens' Delhi. He is too independent. He's not playing the game. But outside that narrow zone, the image begins to sharpen. This president's only permanent ally is the Constitution. He has defeated another rival. The pressure to tilt the scales in favor of his side. The cost of that independence will become visible later. For now, a more literal war is on the horizon. Summer 1999. High in the icy heights of Kargil, Indian soldiers find strangers on their own mountains. Intruders, Pakistani soldiers and militants, have crossed the line of control, dug in on ridges that look down on vital highways. The betrayal is not just military, it is personal. The two countries were talking peace only months before. Body bags begin to arrive in the plains. Television shows grainy footage of shells exploding on bare rock. Mothers in small towns stare at screens trying to guess which tiny figure in fatigues is their son. In theory, the President of India is above war. The generals brief the cabinet orders the operations. The president is supreme commander in the constitutional text, but mostly in a ceremonial sense. Narayanan refuses to treat it as ceremony. In security meetings, he pushes the question that will define the war's moral shape. Will India cross the line of control into Pakistan? Or will it fight a brutal, costly battle limited strictly to its own side of the line? Crossing might yield quick results, but it would also make India look like the aggressor. Not crossing means sending young men up near vertical slopes into enemy fire again and again at horrifying cost. The pressure is immense. There are voices that say, use air power without restraint, strike across, teach them a lesson. Narayanan adds his weight to those arguing for a limited war, For staying on the Indian side of the line, even if the price in blood is higher, he cannot order, but he can advise, warn, remind. When the decision is taken to stay within the line of control, to accept a harder road in order to keep the moral high ground, his sense of history nods quietly. India may win or lose territory, but it will not lose its claim to be different from the regimes it criticizes. Then he does something else that breaks presidential habit. In the bitter cold of the conflict zone, amid gusts of wind that slice through layers of wool, the President of India arrives. Kar. Narayanan, in a heavy coat and cap, meets soldiers whose breath is turning to mist in the air. He listens to their stories, looks at the ridges they must climb, speaks words that are not lines from a prepared script, but the simple language of a man who has known what it is to fight with no margin for error. For men who grew up in villages like his, seeing the first citizen there, on the edge of the battlefield, is a shock that stiffens the spine. Back in Delhi, artillery maps and casualty lists lie under paperweights on his desk. At night, in the stillness of Rashtrapati Bhavan, the Supreme Commander walks alone down corridors once polished for the boots of imperial viceroys. The war ends. India counts its dead and its medals. The world notes that in a decade of coups and collapsed regimes across Asia and Africa, this nuclear-armed democracy has fought a war without losing its head. Inside his 5-year window, Narayanan has now faced two kinds of crisis, a domestic collapse and an external attack, and each time refused the easy, glamorous misuse of power. But the hardest test for a Dalit president in a secular republic is still waiting, with the cruelest of countdowns. In his speeches as president, Narayanan returns again and again to one theme. India's soul is plural. India is a house of many rooms, he says in different words and places. Different faiths, languages, castes, regions, all must feel they have a door they can open, a corner they can claim. He is not naive. He knows from his own childhood how quickly that house can turn into a prison for some. As globalization accelerates at the turn of the millennium, as cities fill with billboards and satellites, he warns that growth without justice will deepen old wounds, not heal them. At state banquets, as foreign leaders raise crystal glasses, Narayanan's toasts weave together talk of software exports and space, missions with references to land reform, education, dignity for manual workers. He uses the soft power of speech to smuggle uncomfortable truths into comfortable rooms. He pushes, within the limited but real influence of the presidency, for affirmative action in the private sector, for inclusive policies. In science and technology, for remembering that untouchability is not a word in history books, but a daily humiliation still suffered by millions. Guests notice small details. Retired sweepers and clerks are seen at celebrations in Rashtrapati Bhavan, standing where once only Nawabs and industrialists stood. He asked that the staff, many from marginalized backgrounds, not be treated as invisible scenery but as citizens with names and stories. These gestures do not change the structure of power overnight, but they are signals sent from the symbolic heart of the Republic that the hierarchy of worth is being quietly challenged. Then in early 2002, as his term races toward its final months, a different kind of fire erupts. In Gujarat, a train coach burns at Godhra. Dozens of passengers die in the flames. The horror is immediately weaponized. Within hours and days, retaliatory violence engulfs towns and villages. Television screens fill with images of houses marked out for attack, shops reduced to ash, families running with whatever they can. Carry eyes wide with the knowledge that their neighbors might be their killers. Reports of police inaction, even complicity, filter up through civil society groups and opposition parties. Children are burnt, women assaulted, prayer halls smashed. Lines that took generations to blur are ripped open in days. In Rashtrapati Bhavan, the 81-year-old president watches the news in the dim light of a winter evening. For a man whose life has been shaped by another system of graded violence, caste, these images are not just communal tension. They are proof that the old poison can still find new veins. He summons the prime minister. Behind closed doors, he uses words that are, for him, unusually sharp. What is happening, he tells Vajpayee, is not just a law and order problem, but a grave crisis of the Republic's conscience. Later, fragments of his phrases will leak into public memory. National shame, a grave injury to the idea of India. His powers are limited. The president cannot send troops on his own, cannot dismiss a state government without the cabinet's advice. But he can refuse to pretend that nothing extraordinary is happening. In his Republic Day address that January, just before the worst of the violence, he had already warned against the growing intolerance and violence in our society in the name of religion. After the bloodshed begins, every word he speaks in public is weighed and watched. Each sentence is a negotiation between constitutional restraint and moral urgency. Inside, another clock is ticking loudly. His term ends in July 2002. He has months, then weeks, to decide how far he can go before the office passes to another man, another style, another history. He considers, according to those who saw him in those days, the full range of his constitutional options. He reads precedent, recalls debates of the Constituent Assembly, consults quietly with legal minds he trusts. He knows that if he overreaches, those waiting to call him a Dalit activist in the president's chair will have their headline. He also knows that if he underreacts, future generations will ask why the first Dalit president remained within the palace while the country burned. In the end, he chooses a path that maximizes moral pressure within legal lines. He does not sign away Gujarat's government over the head of his cabinet, but he refuses to provide the comfort of silence. His speeches, his private letters, his pointed questions become part of the invisible architecture of resistance to the normalization of the riots. For those who wanted a compliant figurehead, this is the final proof. They have miscalculated. The man from the hut has not come to the palace to merely enjoy its gardens. By mid-2002, the political class is already thinking beyond him. There are murmurs of a second term. Some citizens groups, intellectuals, and even politicians across party lines suggest he should be re-elected, kept on as a stabilizing moral voice. But in the smoke-filled back rooms where parties calculate advantage, a different conversation runs. He has been too assertive, some say. Too willing to send back files, to issue warnings that sound uncomfortably like verdicts. Better, perhaps, to choose someone who is inspiring to the public but less likely to push ministers into corners. A name begins to circulate, PJ. Abdul Kalam, the missile man of India, scientist, Muslim, a symbol of technocratic aspiration and pluralism wrapped in a single figure. It is a brilliant political move. Who can publicly object to replacing one barrier-breaking president with another? Narayanan sees the writing on the wall. He does not lobby for a second term. He does not beg or bargain or remind anyone of the files he returned, the balances he preserved, the nights he spent reading the Constitution like a manual written in fire. When asked, he simply says that he has never sought office, and he will not begin now. The deadline that has followed him since the day he entered LSE, since the day he joined the Foreign Service, since the day he took his oath as president finally comes due. On his last morning in Rashtrapati Bhavan, the palace wakes as it always does. Bugles call, flags rise, attendants move through the corridors with polished shoes and quiet steps. In one of the private rooms, K.R. Narayanan folds a few papers, places them in a simple bag. He walks through halls lined with portraits of governors general and presidents, past the high dome where echoes of imperial power still murmur in the stone. Outside, the presidential limousine waits. Beyond the gates, crowds and cameras have gathered to see off the man who carried their constitution like a shield. He pauses for a moment on the steps, looking back at the building that once symbolized everything people like him were forbidden to approach. For a heartbeat, it is possible to imagine him seeing not red sandstone and green lawns, but a mud floor in a Kerala hut, a borrowed lamp, a boy with a book, and no guarantee of tomorrow. Then he walks forward, towards the car, towards the crowd, towards a life after formal power in which his only remaining rival will be the way history chooses to remember him. The first thing to disappear is not the convoy or the guards. It is the echo. For 5 years, every step K.R. Narayanan took inside Rashtrapati Bhavan sent a soft thunder down marbled corridors, answered by salutes, cameras, and the quiet shuffling of people who were never quite sure whether to look at him or the floor. Now, in a smaller government bungalow in Delhi, his feet make almost no sound on the stone. The gate is simpler, the lawns narrower, the sentries fewer. And already, outside those walls, India is learning a ruthless trick. How fast it can move on from the man who was its conscience in high office. That is the new rival waiting for him in retirement. Not a prime minister, not a party, but something colder. Forgetting. Inside, he rises at the same hour he kept as president. The clock has not changed, only the weight of its ticking. He is 82. Doctors speak to him in numbers now. Blood pressure, sugar levels. the statistics of a body that no longer takes orders like a disciplined civil servant. He does his own calculation, 5 years, if fortune is kind, maybe less. A final, unforgiving term, not written into any constitution but set by the biology of a boy born in 1920 in a thatched hut with no doctor in sight. Across the road, traffic surges. At the other end of the capital, crowds of schoolchildren are flocking to hear the new president, PJ Abdul Kalam, talk of rockets and dreams and turning India into a developed nation by 2020. The media loves Kalam's unruly hair, his aphorisms, his handshakes with teenagers. He becomes a phenomenon, a people's president of a different kind. In drawing rooms and news studios, another contest has begun, half-spoken. Which story of India's presidency will this generation remember? The quiet constitutional rebel from a Dalit hut? Or the scientist with a missile and a poem? It is not a personal rivalry. Kalam himself respects Narayanan. But history is not always fair to those who carry heavier, darker themes. Narayanan understands this perfectly. He has not stepped out of Rashtrapati Bhavan to win a popularity contest. What he fears losing is not applause, but a set of hard, unfashionable questions about caste, power, and who India is for. And with every passing month, the clock in his chest beats louder. If you pass by his bungalow in those years, you might mistake it for any retired official's home. Security is visible but not theatrical. There is no swarm of cars, no daily parade of television crews. Inside, however, his study looks like a war room of another kind. Books pile up in avalanches. Constitutional law, Dalit literature, international relations, poetry. The same restless curiosity that carried him from Paramthanam to London refuses to retire. On a table near the window, letters lie in ordered stacks. Some are written in careful English, others in Malayalam or Hindi, still others in shaky hands that barely formed words in any script. A teacher from a village in Uttar Pradesh describes students who must sit on the floor outside the classroom because of their caste. A retired soldier from Bihar thanks him for going to Kargil and asks whether the country will ever fight so hard for justice at home. A young Dalit woman from Tamil Nadu writes that when she saw his portrait in her school, she stared until the peon told her to move. She had never seen anyone with her surname on a wall of power. Narayanan reads them all. He dictates responses, simple, measured, never dramatic. He knows that for many of these writers, the answer itself, the proof that the letter did not vanish into a void, is an act of recognition they have never received before. Invitations arrive too. Universities want him for convocations. Human rights groups ask him to be chief guest. Foreign institutions remember the articulate ambassador from Washington and London and Beijing and offer him honorary doctorates, lecture platforms, awards. He turns down more than he accepts. Energy is a currency he must now spend sparingly. But when the occasion fits his purpose, he travels. At one campus, he faces a sea of black gowns and white collars and asks the new graduates to remember the people who cleaned their hostels and canteens, whose names they never learned but without whom their degrees would be only paper. At another, he tells shining-eyed engineering students that technology without social conscience is just another way of sharpening old inequalities. You can feel the room shift, a tiny discomfort beneath the pride. They did not come for this speech, yet this is the one they are unlikely to forget. He returns to Kerala too, not as the rare visiting son of the soil that he once was, but as an old man revisiting scenes that have become legend. In Paramthanam, the hut of his childhood has long since been rebuilt, improved, painted, yet the earth remembers. He stands outside for a long moment, the crowd pressing, garlands straining under their own weight. In the dust, he can almost see the outline of the spot where his mother once scolded him for reading instead of helping in the fields, and where his father counted out the coins for his education with hands that had never signed a check. The village has changed. Some Dalit families now own small patches of land. Children carry school bags with zippers instead of cloth bundles. But the stories whispered to him under the shade of new concrete porticos sound painfully familiar, of temples that still hesitate to open all doors, wells that some people still do not touch, jobs that rise like mirages but never quite reach certain hands. Narayanan listens, nods, and says again and again with increasing urgency that democracy which does not dissolve caste will sooner or later be dissolved by it. These visits are not nostalgia tours. They are inspections, time-bound audits of a promise he has guarded from the highest office and now must protect with nothing but words the years he thought he might have shrunk faster than expected. In 2003, a mild infection forces him into hospital for the first time since leaving office. The doctors are brisk, reassuring. He emerges thinner but composed. The newspapers note it, then go back to newer stories. India's economy is booming. Cell phones are buzzing in pockets from Gurgaon to Guwahati. A retired president's health is not headline material for more than a single column. He takes the hint. If he wants to leave behind something more durable than a fading news report, he must accelerate. The world beyond India's borders has not become kinder in his retirement. The U.S. invades Iraq in 2003. Television fills with images of shock and awe, of statues toppling, of a new doctrine that says power decides what is legal. Narayanan, the old diplomat who once walked the corridors of the United Nations arguing for a more equal world, watches in silence for a while. Then, at a lecture in Delhi, he departs from his prepared text. Softly but firmly, he speaks of the danger of a global order where some nations wield weapons and vetoes as if they were birthrights, and while others are judged too immature for sovereignty, he warns that when international law bends too easily for the strong, the weak will not believe in it at all. His words do not explode into headlines. There are other commentators, louder, more current. But in certain embassies, in think tanks where analysts remember his stint in Washington, notes are taken. Even without office, this man still refuses to worship raw power. At home, meanwhile, a political change that many of his friends hoped for arrives in 2004. The coalition led by the Bharatiya Janata Party loses power. A new government forms under Manmohan Singh, backed by the Congress and a range of regional parties. Some see it as a chance for a more inclusive, welfare-oriented turn. Others call it an accident, a pause in an inevitable march toward a different kind of nationalism. Narayanan watches carefully. He has known Singh for years, respected his economic mind, but he also knows that structures of inequality do not shift. Simply because a new party hangs its flag over South Block, leaders from across the spectrum visit him now and then, partly out of respect, partly to read which way an older moral compass is pointing. He receives them without ceremony in a simple sitting room where the cushions have begun to sag in comfortable ways. He praises when praise is due, schemes for rural employment, efforts to expand education, steps toward peace with neighbors, and he asks, with disarming directness, what is being done about manual scavenging, about atrocities against Dalits, about the promises of land and dignity that lie crumpled under electoral arithmetic. Some guests shift in their seats. They had not come for a performance review, but they leave with the uneasy sense that a report has been filed somewhere beyond filing cabinets. All the while, the rival that has haunted him since the day he left office continues its stealthy work. In school textbooks, his portrait joins a growing gallery of presidents, each granted a few sentences, dates, positions held, a phrase or two of praise. In popular memory, he risks being flattened into a trivia answer. First Dalit President of India. Important, yes, but smaller than the full, complicated person who returned files, challenged governors' reports, called riots a national shame. He knows that history, especially official history, likes its heroes simple. And he knows that those who speak about caste from positions of authority are often the first to have their edges sanded away. The only weapon he has now against this rounding off is his voice. So he agrees, more than once, to sit for long, searching interviews, to let younger journalists prod at old decisions. Why did you send back that Article 356 file? Would you have dismissed the Gujarat government if the Constitution allowed it? Did you ever feel like resigning in protest? He answers without melodrama. He explains his choices in the vocabulary of the Constitution, not as acts of personal heroism but as duties of an office that had been underused before him. Yet beneath the lawyerly care, something else glints, a quiet defiance that says, do not turn my story into a comfortable anecdote. I was not there to make your conscience feel good. I was there to make it work. On December days in 2004, the air in Delhi turns knife-cold and clear. Far to the south and east, another disaster unfolds. An undersea earthquake sends a wall of water crashing into the coasts of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The Indian Ocean tsunami rips away homes, boats, entire families. Narayanan is no longer in office. No one looks to him for emergency orders. But when news of the waves reaches him, he sits for a long time staring at the television, at fishermen's villages distorted into matchsticks and mud. Perhaps it is because he grew up in a land of monsoons and cyclones, where nature always carried a faint scent of threat. Perhaps it is because each new disaster reminds him of the old, ongoing one that never makes it to prime time, the slow violence of poverty and humiliation. He sends a personal donation, as many do. More than the amount, he insists that it be anonymous at first. Charity should not become another kind of publicity. But when pressure mounts, when organizers argue that the former president's example will spur others to give, he relents. His name appears briefly on lists of contributors, then vanishes in the flood of other information. What he lingers on is a different detail. Reports that Dalit survivors in some camps are made to stand at separate queues for food, or asked to clean up what others will not touch, even in the middle of catastrophe. Even the sea, he says bitterly to a close associate, does not discriminate, but we do. The line is never delivered from a public platform. It stays in the private recollection of those who heard it, a distilled summary of the fight he has fought all his life. The fight is catching up with his body. By late 2005, his visits outside the house have grown rare. Walking leaves him breathless. A stubborn cough refuses to obey antibiotics. He does what he has always done in moments of pressure, reads harder. Younger visitors find him with a shawl around his shoulders, spectacles sliding down his nose, a pencil in hand, underlining passages of Ambedkar, Gandhi, Tagore, and newer Dalit thinkers who push even farther. His doctor scolds him for staying up past midnight. He smiles and says, half joking, half serious, that at his age sleep is an extravagance India cannot afford from him. The rivalry with forgetting has become a race against his lungs. In early November, his condition worsens sharply. Doctors diagnose pneumonia complicated by kidney failure. He is admitted to the Army Hospital in Delhi. Machines begin to do what his organs cannot. Monitors blink green and red, singing a harsh electronic lullaby. Visitors are restricted. His wife Usha and daughters, Chitra and Amrita, keep vigil. Between bouts of oxygen and blurred waking, he is said to have asked, not about himself, but about the state of the country, about atrocities in the news, about whether reservations in education are being diluted or defended. Even here his worry runs along the old groove, not will I live, but will what I believed in outlive me. On November 9, 2005, at the age of 85, Kocheril Raman Narayanan draws his final breath. The machines fall silent. The tick of the clock that has followed him since Perumthanam stops without ceremony. A state funeral is arranged with the precision of a choreography he once directed for others. The tricolor is wrapped around his coffin. Gun salutes crack the air. Leaders from every party, from embassies and international institutions, stand in rows, their faces arranged in the solemn mask that history demands on such days. On television, commentators reach for adjectives: scholar president, working president, constitutional conscience, first Dalit president. In the streets leading to the cremation ground, the crowd is different. Office workers in cheap shirts, construction laborers with dust in their hair, students in imitation brand sneakers, women with the red earth of distant villages still clinging to the hem of their saris. Among them, a noticeable number are Dalits. Some have traveled overnight in unreserved compartments, clutching steel tiffin carriers and plastic bags. They do not know the finer points of Article 356 or the exact phrasing of his speeches on pluralism, but they know this. One of their own reached the chair at the top and did not forget what it felt like at the bottom. As the pyre is lit, smoke rises in a slow gray column. If you stand far enough away, you might imagine that it looks like a question mark drawn against the sky. What, it seems to ask, will we do now with the space this life has opened? In the years that follow, the answer is messy, incomplete. Some presidents after him are more assertive than their predecessors, less willing to behave like ornamental seals. They cite, sometimes implicitly, the precedent he set when he returned that Bihar file, when he insisted that the head of state is not just a guest of the government, but a guardian of the text on which it stands. Dalit representation in politics and bureaucracy, inch upward, step back, inch upward again. New Dalit writers, filmmakers, activists push the conversation far beyond what was possible in his youth. And yet caste atrocities continue. Manual scavengers still climb into sewers. Children are still made to sit at the back. In a sense, his greatest competitor outlives him, the stubborn mutating system that says some humans are worth less than others, but so does his answer. In a small room somewhere, Perhaps in a Kerala village, perhaps in a basti in Uttar Pradesh, perhaps in a block of cramped rental, rooms on the edge of Delhi. A child sits at a cheap wooden desk under the harsh light of a single naked bulb. On the page in front of them, a question from a civics book. Who was the 10th president of India? Write a short note on his life and contribution. They begin with the obvious: dates, positions, first Dalit president. Then, maybe prompted by a teacher, maybe by a sentence half remembered from a documentary or from the way their parents spoke of him, they add something else. They write that he refused to be a rubber stamp, that he spoke for those whom others did not see, that he believed India is a house of many rooms and spent his years unlocking doors. The bulb flickers. Outside, someone is burning garbage. The smoke seeps in, itching the eyes. The child keeps writing. In that cramped, imperfect space, the rivalry that shaped K, our Narayanan's life enters a new phase. Forgetting will always try to close the file. But as long as there is even one more hand picking up a pen to write his name, not as trivia but as testimony, the boy from the thatched hut will go on out, arguing the empire of silence. He spent his whole life refusing to serve.